Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby, and today we're going to be doing my March wrap-up. And in the month of March, I was able to read 22 books. I had a really great reading month for the most part. And if you were wondering, I had a number of DNFs this month. I want to say I had maybe like 8 DNFs total. I feel like I'm becoming even more ruthless lately with my DNFs, but it's also because life is too short, and if I'm not enjoying these books, I'm not going to finish them. But I think some of the most shocking DNFs that I had this month, one of them was No Matter What by Cara Stone. This was one of my most anticipated romance books of the year because I really love the book Ready or Not from this author. But this romance book, I got 130 pages in and I was just so bored. I didn't care about the characters and there was so much miscommunication between them. I actually couldn't stand it. Another romance that I was really looking forward to that I also DNF'd was How to Write a Love Story by Catherine Walsh. This one I also got pretty far into. I got 115 pages into this one. I just really wasn't vibing with it. I don't know, I didn't really like these characters that much, especially this character Sierra. I just really wasn't connecting with her and she was actually kind of driving me nuts. Another romance that I was really looking forward to that I also DNF'd is Anderson in Bloom. This one is a sapphic romance that I thought was going to be so cute, but I got about 80 pages into this one and it was just reading so young. I think it could be because this author has written a lot of young adult books in the past. I also DNF'd the romance book Still Into You by Erin Connor, which, this was another one that I was looking forward to so much. I got about 20% of the way through this one on audio and like once again, it just was boring me. It was not pulling me in. I didn't care about the characters. And then sadly, another DNF that I'm so upset about is I Love You Don't Die by Jade Song. I was so excited for this book because of how much I loved Chlorine by this author. Not only that, but like this is one of the most beautiful book covers I've ever seen. Like, not to be shallow, but this is stunning. And this is another book where I got about 100 pages in and I just did not care. Like the writing style in this book just really wasn't working for me. And I think because this book is actually literary fiction and it's not horror at all, I just think I was losing interest in the story. I mean, this one for me right now, it's a temporary DNF because I want to believe that I can come back to this in a few months and really appreciate it more. Maybe I'll wait around and see if the reviews are absolutely glowing for this book and they can convince me to finish it, but for right now, it's a DNF. I also wanted to mention that in the month of March, I ended up making this exclusive video on my Patreon that was called a sleepover vlog. I had so much fun with this video, like genuinely one of my favorite videos that I've ever made on my Patreon. I ended up reading the book Dollface by Lindy Ryan in that video, and the whole theme of the vlog was like the idea that we were having a sleepover together, and I just had so much fun with it. And I also wanted to mention that in the month of April, I'm gonna be hosting a cute little 48-hour readathon on my Patreon in the last weekend of April. And the readathon is called the Cozy Cosmos Readathon, and the whole goal for this little readathon is going to be to read some sci-fi books that might be on your TBR. And you don't necessarily have to read sci-fi books for this readathon. I do have some other prompts like reading a book with stars on the cover or things like that. But for me, I'm definitely going to be trying to read some sci-fi books during this weekend readathon. So if that sounds like something you might want to join, then I will have my Patreon link down below. Yeah, March ended up being a really crazy busy month for me. I actually had to do jury duty service for like 2.5 weeks in the month of March. You know, I got my jury duty summons in the mail and I wasn't even sure if I was going to be needed because I've been summoned now a few times and I never had to go in. And this time it was actually really crazy because I got assigned to a trial that lasted for 2.5 weeks. Now that the trial is over, I can finally talk about it, but that ate up a huge amount of my time this month that I wasn't expecting. So I do apologize if my vlogs were like slacking in any way because jury duty took up so much of my time, but it was actually also really great because there's a lot of downtime during jury duty as well, which gave me a lot of time to read. And it was overall a really good experience actually. I was always so anxious about the idea of like having to serve on a jury duty trial, but after doing it, I actually really enjoyed it. It was really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the books. I'm going to be starting with my lowest rated books as I usually do, and then working my way up to the highest rated books that I had this month. Starting off with the lowest rated book that I had this month, and that was actually a 1-star book, Hiding Lies. I feel so terrible for giving this book 1 star, by the way, because this was actually a recommendation from my friend Brittany, and I feel so bad that I gave this book 1 star, but I just really didn't like this one. This book actually reminded me a lot of the Mindfuck series, because in this story, you're following this woman. She's working as a forensics photographer in the Pacific Northwest, and they keep coming across these crime scenes that are like the worst crime scenes that they've ever seen, and she finds herself being like absolutely fascinated by these killings and she's almost like obsessed. And then we also follow from the perspective of this guy who is the serial killer that's doing these killings. And honestly, like, I don't know whose perspective irritated me more, to be honest, because in her perspective, she would constantly bring up the fact that she has this like dark side where like nobody knows that she actually thinks about murder all the time. But then in his perspective, he thinks that he's like so brilliant and so charming and that nobody could possibly ever catch him because he's just so good at what he does. And I just don't think the writing in this book was very good because it was like anytime there was was a moment of tension in the plot or anything interesting was happening, it just got resolved within like 2 pages and there was never any like high stakes. And then if that wasn't bad enough, in the second half of this book, we start to get this romance developing, and like that was the most cringiest thing. One book that I ended up giving 2 stars to was Next of Kin, and this one was a romance book that I read for the video where I read books that were inspired by my favorite TV shows, because this one was recommended for fans of Gilmore Girls, apparently because the main love interest in this book is supposed to be very Jess coded, which I can definitely see, and I do think that he's Jess coded in some ways, but wow, this book was so frustrating to read. Not only because this book had so much insta-love, but also because this guy was kind of an asshole. I know all of it just felt a little bit far-fetched for me to get behind in the first place, but then the romance itself was so insta-love and like honestly like insta-lust. I'm really shocked because I have given this author 5 stars in the past, so like I don't know what this book was, but I just didn't really care for it. And then sadly, I ended up giving 2.5 stars to Dollface by Lindy Ryan. This one had all of the potential in the world, and I was really excited to read this because it was pitched as Barbie meets Scream. And after hearing that, I was like, bitch, sign me up, because I love Barbie and I love Scream. And in this story, we're actually following this woman named Jill, and she is a horror author, which is something that I was so excited to read about because I love stories that follow writers, but especially when they're an author of horror, I think that's so fun. And she's recently moved to New Jersey, and this book is kind of about how she's like getting involved with like the local PTA moms because she has these 2 kids and she has this husband. And then as she's getting more familiar and involved in her community, all these murders start happening. And this story does kind of end up being your typical slasher, except that I had a few issues with this because not only did I find this book to be so predictable, which sucks, but then also I really didn't like the last plot twist in this book. I just thought it came out of nowhere and it was so ridiculous, and I feel like it kind of diminishes the message that I thought that this book was trying to have earlier in the story. But then also like the writing in this book was so repetitive, like it was driving me crazy because this main character's name is Jill, and the amount of times that we hear the nickname Jilly Bean, it was ridiculous. I already find nicknames to be so annoying, and like that has to be one of the most annoying nicknames I've ever heard in my life. But then also like the way that she would refer to her husband, she would literally say, "My darling husband," every single time she referred to him, and like I'm not even joking, there would be multiple times per page that she would say, "My darling husband did this, my darling husband did that." Why the repetition? I don't understand. Maybe it was intentional, I don't really know, but it was so annoying for me. So I only ended up giving this one 2.5 stars, and like the more that I talk about it, the more I'm like, maybe it's a 2 star. And then one book that I ended up giving 3 stars to was this one called Paradise Logic. This is a book that I was really excited to read because all I heard about it was that it was really weird and that we're just following this woman named Reality who is trying to be the greatest girlfriend of all time. And that's essentially what the plot of this book is. I don't know, for me, this book was such a strange reading experience that like, I don't even really know how to talk about this. It honestly kind of feels like a fever dream. You're not really sure what's happening for most of the story. And I think as much as I love weird books, there was just something about this one that just didn't really work for me. I don't know, it was a 3 star for me and it was kind of on the lower end of my 3 stars. I think it was because so much of this book felt like satire that it was almost like overkill, because I can appreciate satire and I do love when books have a lot of heavy, you know, commentary in them like this one does. But I guess when the satire goes on for like literally the entire book, it just starts to get repetitive for me and it starts to get boring. I don't know, I was so fascinated by the concept in this book and that's what kept me, you know, flipping the pages, but it was just a lot and it kept getting more strange. It honestly reminded me of my experience when I read the book We Love You Bunny, because there was something about Reality's voice in this book, like it reminded me a lot of the bunnies from We Love You Bunny, and that was a book that I gave 2 stars. Like I really didn't like the sequel to Bunny. Another horror book that I just read recently that I gave 3 stars to is the one called Strange Buildings. This is the 3rd book that I've read from this author, and this one's another Japanese translated horror book. And these horror books are really fascinating because they include a lot of like different illustrations throughout the book. And the whole premise of this book is that there's these different characters that are reaching out to him about weird stories that they have with like the layout of their house or the layout of these buildings, and they're trying to understand if there's a reason for that. And so in this book, you go through 11 different case files of like different things that have happened to people, different stories that this author's going through. All of that's fictional, by the way. I don't know why I said that as if this is like nonfiction, but it's not, it's fictional. But I always love the beginning of these books so much because I love going through the 11 different case files. It's almost like an anthology with a bunch of different short stories about all of these weird things that have happened. And of course, there's some that I liked more than the others, but in general, I really love the opening parts of these books. But then these books always fall apart in the second half for me because after you go through the 11 case files, you just get this very long section of this author like putting all the pieces together. And while that does sound interesting in theory, I feel like there's just so much info dumping and like so much exposition in the second half of these books that it really just like loses me, and I don't have a lot of interest in that part. I think my favorite is Strange Pictures out of the 3 that I've read. I will continue to pick them up because I do think they're very fun and very interesting, at least until that second half, and then it just kind of like loses me altogether. And then another book that I ended up only giving 3 stars to is Strangers in the Villa by Robin Harding. You know, I was talking about this in the vlog where I read this book, but like I always end up picking up Robin Harding's thrillers, and then I almost always end up giving them 3 stars. But Robin Harding is one of my favorite thriller authors regardless, because there's something so readable about her thrillers. Like, she's like the perfect author to read if you're dealing with a little bit of a reading slump, or if you just want something that's going to be like a popcorn thriller, like something that's going to be quick. But this is one that I think is actually going to be a little bit on the lower end for me when it comes to all of the books that I've read from Robin Harding, because this one was just very forgettable. What I liked about this was the setup was very fun, because you're following this married couple who has recently moved from the US to Spain, and the reason why they moved is because her husband was actually cheating on her with this woman in the office, and so she's decided to give him another chance. But the thing is that she wants to get out of America and like leave everything behind and go to Spain. There's these 2 Australian strangers who show up on their doorstep, and they're like, oh my god, our van just broke down, do you mind if we use your phone? And then after getting their van checked out, they realize that it's gonna be a couple of days before the van can get repaired. So then this woman offers to let these strangers stay at their villa with them for a few days. I was absolutely loving the first half of this book. Like, I was tearing through the pages because I thought it was so interesting. And when we hit part 2 of the book, I thought it was even more interesting for about like 20 pages. But then once I started to realize like what was actually happening in this book, I started to lose interest very fast, which really sucks. And then by the second half of this book, I was so bored that I was just kind of like skimming to see how it ends. So this is one that I actually don't really think that I would recommend, at least not when it comes to Robin Harding's thrillers. Like, I definitely have others that I've loved more from her. And then another book that I only ended up giving 3 stars to is A Deal with the Devil. This one hurts because this was a book that I wanted to love so desperately, because this is a romance book that I've been looking forward to a long time, because I've read one book from this author before and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 3.5 stars, but this one just wasn't as enjoyable for me, because in this story we're following from the perspective of this woman who gets this job working as an assistant to this guy named Hayes Flynn. This character Hayes, not only is he a plastic surgeon, but he's also kind of like your typical like bad boy kind of love interest, where he's British, he's snobby, he has a bit of an attitude, he's a renowned playboy. And I don't know, for me, there was just something about his character, like I just never really warmed up to him. I feel like characters that are written in this way, they could go one of 2 ways for me really, and it's either that I never warm up to his character, or once he starts to show a softer side, I also grow softer towards that character. But for some reason, with the way that this book was written, I just never really cared for Hayes as a character, and I think that definitely affected my overall enjoyment of the story, because I really liked this female character. I thought she was great, and I love that she was a writer in this book as well. I think she's writing a fantasy novel, if I remember correctly, and I love that she has a strong relationship with her sister in this book, and that's basically like why she's doing everything that she's doing is for her sister. Alright, now jumping into the books that I've rated a little bit higher. These are still some of my 3-star reads, but you know how I was mentioning how sometimes you have 3-star reads that are rather forgettable and just not very entertaining, and then you have some 3-star reads that you feel very passionately about? These are the 3-star reads that I feel a little bit more passionately about. Like, I feel like I could have rated them higher. One of those books that I feel very strongly about is You Watched in Silence. Oh, this was a horror book that could have been everything, because this is a horror book that actually includes a sapphic romance in the story, and it was compared to The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is one of my favorite shows of all time. And I love that this book takes place in the Pacific Northwest, like in Washington. It takes place on this little island. And in this story, we're following this woman named Caitlin, who is a really big fan of this girl named Bella, who is an influencer. And she's such a big fan that she's a part of this like really exclusive group chat that Bella has started with some of her biggest fans. And Bella ends up sending out this message that is like, hey, does anybody have childcare experience? I'm looking to hire somebody to be my nanny. And Caitlin is the one who reaches out and gets this job. And so this book is about how Caitlin is going to be like moving onto her property and like taking care of her children. And then it's also kind of a romance that starts to form between this girl, Caitlin, and the chef that works there named Hannah. This book was so fascinating for so many reasons. Like, it just had the best setup for me, because not only did I love the Pacific Northwest atmosphere and the stormy vibes, but there was also some like really creepy atmosphere with like the woods. You know, like she would take the children out into the woods and there would be these creepy scenes where she felt like she was being watched. And I just loved the overall atmosphere, and I was really enjoying enjoying the romance at the start of this, but I feel like the romance just really dropped the ball for me because it became so insta-love between them so fast. Only after like 2 seconds, why are we calling each other babe? Why are you like, oh my god, this is the greatest romance I've ever had in my whole life? Which sucks because this romance could have been everything. Like, I was really, really into it at the start. And then also, just like the mystery and the horror elements in this book got so ridiculous in the second half of this book. Oh my god, I can't even tell you. It just really sucks watching it all fall apart in slow motion. Like, I swear, I want to like rewrite this book myself. You know, I'm like, give me the pen, I'll do it myself. So unfortunately, this one was only 3 stars, but this one had so much potential, and I'm definitely going to be checking out more books from this author in the future because I really loved the writing in this for the first half. Another 3-star that I had this month that I had a lot of feelings about was this book called Supernatural Nevermore, and this one is actually like a TV show tie-in book. So in this story, it basically is like an episode of Supernatural that like never made it onto the show, essentially. And it's actually really cool because in the front of this book, they have a little note that tells you which episodes this story would take place in between. And this particular story is taking place in between 2 episodes of season 2 of Supernatural. And the reason why I was so excited to read this one is because this is a story about how Sam and Dean have to go to New York to solve this case about this haunted house. And because New York is one of my favorite places in the world, I was really excited to read this. And I think if you are a fan of the show, like, you will definitely find some things in this book to enjoy. There were definitely some moments that felt exactly like the show that was so much fun. But honestly, I do feel like I've read fan fiction for Supernatural that's like better than this book. And sometimes I do feel like the way that these characters spoke or like the things they did, I was like, that is so not how Sam or Dean would react to that. It was very strange. This is another 3-star that I had such passionate feelings about because I was like, give me the pen, I'll do it myself. I also ended up giving only 3 stars to Heated Rivalry, which this was kind of a bummer just because of how much I love the show. And I know it's so rare to ever say this, but I actually would really recommend the show over the book because I do think the show is just like so much better. This book was just really hard for me to get into at the start of it because this book starts off with a sex scene in the prologue. Like, it just jumps right into it and I'm like, whoa, what? Who are these people? And that's why I feel like after seeing the show, it's so much better to jump into this book because then you're already familiar with the characters in a way. Because if I had read this book first, honestly, like, I probably would have DNF'd it. And almost the entire like first half of this book is just nothing but smut scene after smut scene after smut scene, and it's just a lot. But then finally in the second half of this book, that's where we get some of the like softer moments, like some of the more vulnerable moments from these characters, and I really warmed up to them in the second half. And I actually thought the second half was so good. There were some scenes that were in the show that were like some of my favorite scenes ever, and like they weren't even in the book. Or at least in my opinion, like they were very half-assed in the book compared to like how fleshed out those scenes were in the show. I ended up giving this one 3 stars because I really loved the second half of this book so much more than the first half, but I also just didn't really love the writing in this series as much as I was expecting to. Like, I've heard that the later books do get better. I think I might just like stick to watching the show instead because the show is actually so good. Another book that I only ended up giving 3 stars to was actually the sequel to the book called Shot in the Dark, which I also read this month. But the book that I gave 3 stars is the sequel that's called Hunted in the Shadows. And this one's kind of hard to talk about without talking about Shot in the Dark because this one, spoiler alert, I gave it 5 stars. I'm obsessed. I love this book. I was really surprised by this experience this month, you know, because I am not a big romantasy reader, but this was the first romantasy book I ever read that I gave 5 stars to. And I think the main reason why I was loving this series as much as I was is because these books literally read like an episode of Supernatural. Because in both of these books, we are following these characters named Cliff and John, and both of them are hunters, and they are literally so Sam and Dean coded in like every single way possible. And then in this book, the love interest is this girl named Sylvia, and she's a fairy. She's literally like tiny, like the size of Tinkerbell. Just look at how cute they are. Oh my gosh, like the artwork included is my absolute favorite thing ever. But I read this book in early March and I absolutely loved it and I gave it 5 stars. And then I read Hunted in the Shadows and I thought that this one was just okay. I just didn't really love this sequel as much as I loved the first book. Like, it just didn't really have that same magic to me that the first book did. And I think I was not nearly as invested in the case that they were working on in the second book compared to the first book. But I think the main reason why I continue to love this series is because of these characters. Oh my god, they're so good. I actually think the romance though was so much better in the first book. Like, the second book just didn't really have me like kicking my feet screaming over them the way that the first book did. But I also really loved Cliff's character development in the second book. His character is so Dean Winchester in like every single way, but otherwise it was just okay. I didn't love it quite as much, but I still think that I would like to check out the third book when it publishes this summer. One of the horror books that I gave 3.5 stars to was The Mean Ones. This was another one that was so interesting and it had so much potential for me. I really loved that in this story we're following this woman who has this very mysterious past. We follow her perspective in 2 different timelines. In the present day timeline, she's an adult and she has this boyfriend and they're going to be going out into the wilderness with their friends. She's kind of nervous about going into the wilderness because of this experience that she had when she was a teenage girl. And in alternate chapters, we do get flashbacks of her time at this camp with these young girls that she was friends with. This is one of those characters where like she has a lot of trauma and you don't always know if you can trust her perspective because she's constantly hearing voices in her head and she's like seeing things that aren't there. And this is a book that I really struggled to rate as well because there were so many things that I loved about this book, but I think the main reason why I couldn't rate it any higher than I did is because I found the main character to be pretty annoying with like how insecure she was about things. You would read chapters in the past where she was constantly like comparing herself to her friends and she was always feeling very insecure around her friends, but then those same insecurities definitely followed her into adulthood with the way that she's like with this guy, this boyfriend who's treating her so terribly and she just lets him, and it was really frustrating. I was like, girl, you need to kick him to the curb. Like, what are we doing? And that just went on a little bit long for me. I have so many mixed feelings though about the second half of this book because there were some things that I thought were so interesting and like there was definitely a twist that I didn't see coming, but then there was another big thing that I thought was very predictable, and just some of the writing in the second half, it got really weird. I don't know, this one was only 3.5 stars, but it was very memorable. I also ended up giving 3.5 stars to this short story collection called Mouth by Paloma Ghosh. This one is listed on Goodreads as both literary fiction and horror, and this one is a collection of 11 short stories. And I gave this one 3.5 stars because this is another one that's kind of hard to rate because some of the stories I really didn't care for. Some of them I only gave like 2 or 2.5 stars to, but most of the stories I gave around like 3 to 3.5. And then I had 2 short stories that I gave 4 stars and 1 that I gave 5 stars. The one that I loved the most was this one that was called Leaving Things, and that one was about this woman who was working as a vet, and while she's working at this clinic, they bring in this werewolf and she discovers that the werewolf is pregnant, and then she takes the werewolf back home to her apartment, and then things get really weird from there. This collection of stories was so creative and so weird and so random, and I loved how speculative a lot of these stories got. I talked about some of the other stories that I really loved in the vlog where I read it, so I will have that vlog linked down below, but overall this one was like 3.5 stars. And then this next romance book is one that I gave like 3.75 stars if I'm being really technical about things, and that's And Now Back to You by B.K. Borison. God, this is another book that sent me on a roller coaster with how I was feeling about it because this one's technically the sequel to First Time Caller, which is a romance book that I really enjoyed, and I gave that one 3.5 stars, and I do think that I enjoyed this one slightly more than First Time Caller, even though I do have a lot of the same critiques when it comes to this book, because my main critiques for First Time Caller was that the book just felt a little bit too long and that there was a lot of annoying miscommunication between these two in the second half, which is exactly how I feel about this one. Because tell me why this book is over 430 pages, I don't know. I don't think it needs to be that long, especially when the second half of this book gets so bogged down by this miscommunication between these characters. It was just so frustrating. But the thing that I loved so much about this book is that we're following these characters, Delilah and Jackson, and both of them are working as meteorologists. It's just a really fun and unique job to read about, and I really did connect with both of their characters. Like, I love the fact that Jackson is trying to be a guardian to his younger sisters, and then I also love that Delilah's dealing with a lot of stuff in her personal life as well that's been really hard, and they have the chance to kind of like open up to each other and really support each other through these hard things. And this book had so many romance tropes that I really typically love. I mean, not only do we get the like enemies to lovers and kind of like the workplace, you know, like close proximity type of thing, but we also do get the trope of like, oh no, there's only one bed in a hotel kind of a situation, which I love. I eat that shit up. There was one chapter in particular, I think it was chapter 17, that had me gooped and gagged. Like, I loved that chapter. The amount of giddiness that I felt from that chapter, like I was squealing, and I was fully expecting to give this book like 4 stars or maybe even 5 stars, but I feel like the second half of this book just really frustrated me. Alright, now jumping into my favorite books that I've read this month. One of the books that I gave 4 stars to was this one called Days at the Murasaki Bookshop. This one is a Japanese translated book that is actually on the shorter side. It's only about 130 pages long. And in this story, we're following this woman who is dealing with like a lot of big changes in her life. She finds out that this guy that she's been dating for a while is going to be getting married to this other girl unexpectedly. And so her uncle, who owns this bookstore in Tokyo's famous book district, he asks her if she wants to come and live with him for a while and like work in his bookstore, and she decides to take him up on that. And this one is definitely one of those like slice of life type of stories as you're following this character who is like rediscovering what she wants out of life, and she's starting to bond with this uncle who she never really had much of a relationship with before. I loved this. It was just so beautiful. It was so wholesome. This is one of those books that really like makes you think about your own life and like what our purpose is in life. One of my favorite quotes and like one of the moments that really stuck with me was when she was talking about how she feels like she's been wasting her time, and he says, "I don't think so. It's important to stand still sometimes. Think of it as a little rest rest in the long journey of your life. This is your harbor, and your boat is just dropping anchor here for a little while. And after you're well rested, you can set sail again. Just like moments like that are just so wholesome and so sweet, and it kind of like changes your perspective perhaps on your own life. I just love books like this, and this was so comforting to read. I also ended up reading Pizza Girl, and I gave this one 4 stars as well. This one really surprised me. This one is a literary fiction book where we're following this young girl who's 18 years old. She's living in Los Angeles and she's working at this pizza place, and she recently found out that she's pregnant, and she has a lot of mixed feelings about this pregnancy. Like, she's not really sure if it's something that she wants. And the story really takes off where there's this woman named Jenny who calls her pizza shop, and she said she's new to the area and she has this young boy who will refuse to eat anything else, and she asks if they can make a pizza with pickles on it. And so this story is about how this young girl kind of goes out of her way to help this woman making the pizza, going and delivering it to her, starts to become obsessed with this woman named Jenny who she made this pizza for, and how she kind of has this huge impact on her life. And this book was just so interesting. I just love the writing in this book so much. I mean, you know, it's a good sign when I'm like actually going and putting tabs in a library book, because there were so many interesting and like thoughtful moments that I wanted to come back to. I guess I just really connected to this character in this book. She almost reminded me of like the characters from an Emily Austen novel. And I also wanted to compare this book to like Juno, where you're just following this young girl who's pregnant and she like doesn't really know what she wants out of life. I'm also very surprised that this book is also a debut. This one actually came out in 2020, and I don't think this author has published anything since, which is so wild because I really want to read more from this author because I loved the writing in this book so much more than I was expecting to. Another 4-star read that I had is this romance book called Please Don't Go by E. Salvador. And this romance book is one that I have been reading for months. I've actually been reading this book since late January, because if you couldn't tell, this is a massive romance book. It's over 500 pages. And I actually started reading this book on my Kindle in January, and then I was loving it so much that I decided to order a physical copy. But then I feel like the middle of this book, it started to get a little bit slow for me, so I set it aside, and I didn't mean to set it aside for as long as I did. And then I read about another 100 pages, and then I set it aside again, and I didn't finish this book until the very end of March. But I'm giving this book 4 stars because I really loved my experience with reading this book for the most part. Like, it wasn't a perfect 5-star for me for a few reasons. So in the opening chapter of this book, we're following this girl named Josie, and she is literally standing on the cliffside, like ready to end her life. And in the opening chapter of the book, we follow this guy Daniel as he's like convincing her not to end her life. And that's kind of where the story takes off. So it's already starting on a point that is like very intense and very emotional. This guy Daniel, he's actually on the baseball team at his university, and it says that he's a potential 1st-round pick for the MLB, so like he could potentially have a future in baseball. And then she's actually a student at the same university. And as the story starts to go on, you start to realize that both of these characters actually have a lot of different trauma that they're working through, and both of these characters have a lot of different mental health things that they're working through. I just loved the way that these characters were written. Like, I felt so immediately connected to both Josie and Daniel. I just love the way that the romance was written between them, because at times it was just so wholesome and like so cute. But then I also really loved the way that the smutty scenes were written as well. Like, it was just so my taste in romance. I think the only reason why I didn't give this one 5 stars is because, like I was saying, the middle of this book just really starts to drag. I think the ending was just a little bit long for me. Like, this was the kind of story where it was like epilogue, a second epilogue, a third epilogue, and I was like, I don't need all of that. But for the most part, I really enjoyed this book, and I love sports romances like this, especially ones that follow baseball players. I feel like it's something that I want to read more of because I'm such a big fan of baseball, and I love that this is going to be the first book in a series, so I will definitely be reading more from this author in the future. One of the thrillers that I read this month that I gave 4.5 stars to was Man of My Dreams, and this one is actually an arc that I read on my Kindle. This book's going to be publishing in the month of June, and I'm so thrilled that I love this book as much as I did, because the premise for this is so fun, and it's so right up my alley with what I like in books. Because in this story, we're following this woman who is a romance author, and she's living in New York City. She's working on her next book when she runs into this guy named Liam, and she kind of freaks out because this guy Liam is like almost identical to the character that she's currently writing in her second book, like to a T. Like, he has the same name, he has the same look, he's an architect just like he is in the book. Oh my god, this was such a fun thriller, and the thing that I loved the most about this was that at the start of this book, it really does kind of read like a romance, and so I loved that this kind of felt like it had the perfect balance of like romance and thriller, because as you're starting to get to know this character, you start getting these flashback chapters of like things that happened to her a long time ago, and it's just really like building this mystery, and there were so many more layers to this story than I was expecting. And at the very end of this book, there were a lot of like fun little twisty things. Like, there were definitely some that I did see coming, but then I was really shocked by the things that I did not see coming. It was just such a good one, and I loved the New York atmosphere in this book. Like, there was so much New York atmosphere, so I think if you like books that take place in New York, this one's gonna be your jam, and I highly recommend checking this one out when it comes out in June. It was so fun. I also ended up giving 4.5 stars to this book called The Neighbor. This is a book that I had literally never heard of before in my life before my friend Brittany recommended it to me. I actually think this book had the perfect balance of like thriller, horror, and romance, which is just like my absolute top favorite things. And in this story, The Neighbor, you're following this woman who is a single mother of 4 children. She has 4 daughters, and you're just kind of following her life as she's living in this neighborhood. And then there's this guy named Nolan Steele who like moves in right next to her, and all the neighbors are like talking about him, being like, oh my god, he's so mysterious, what does he do? He drives a truck, he's really cute. And the story's about how she's starting to get to know this guy who's her neighbor, but then like some weird things start happening in her house and like to her children. Oh my god, one of my favorite things in a horror book is like when children start acting creepy and like start acting weird, like when they're seeing shadow people and shit. It's genuinely so creepy, and like this book had the best atmosphere. I also love that this book is taking place around Halloween time, like around that time of year. Oh my god, the atmosphere was just incredible in this. This book, I had to give it 4.5 stars because of how much fun I had reading this book and the fact that it was over 400 pages and I devoured it in one afternoon on my Kindle. Like I could not put this down. It was just so entertaining and I really connected to the writing and the characters. The only reason why I couldn't give this the full 5 stars was because I felt like something was wrapped up a little bit too quickly at the end. Like I wanted it to be a little bit more fleshed out in certain parts, but for the most part, I can't really complain. I loved this book. I thought it was so fun. And then I know I briefly touched on this earlier, but I also gave 5 stars to Shot in the Dark, and this was such an unexpected new favorite of mine. I actually only ended up reading this book this month because I read it for the video where I was reading books inspired by my favorite shows, and this book kept popping up as a recommendation for fans of Supernatural, and after reading it, I can definitely see why. Genuinely think if you're a huge fan of Supernatural, you would love this book series. And because I'm more of a Sam Winchester girl myself, I love this series so much because the love interest John, he's the hunter that's a little bit more like Sam, and I think I love this series so much because the romance between him and Sylvia is so wholesome and so cute in these books. You know, because she's like the size of like a tiny little fairy, the romance between them is not necessarily like physical, it's more of like a mental thing as they're getting to know each other. It's just so sweet. And I was just really obsessed with this book because I love the way that it feels like you're watching an episode of Supernatural. Like it kind of plays out as if it's its own episode. And then these last 2 books that I read this month, these are both easy 5 stars for me, and like I can't decide which of these books is like my favorite romance book that I've read so far this year. The first one is this one called The Mashup, and this is actually an arc that I read on my Kindle. This book is going to be publishing in the month of July, but oh my god, this book was everything. If you're a huge fan of 13 Going on 30, then I'm gonna need you to like drop everything and read this book this summer, because in this story we're following this woman named Ruby, and right at the start of this book it's her birthday, but she's kind of going through a really hard time because her boyfriend, this guy who's kind of a douchebag, like she thought that he was gonna propose, but instead he's like, no, I'm actually taking a job in New York and I'm like leaving you behind. On that night of her birthday, her best friend ends up bringing her this game of MASH that they played together when they were like 13 years old. MASH, by the way, was like one of my favorite games to play when I was growing up, so like it was so fun and so nostalgic just to even talk about MASH. But the reason why this book is so fun and nostalgic is because this character, the next morning when she wakes up, she finds herself in this like alternate reality where like her MASH game has like come to life, and she's living in this mansion, she's driving this like tie-dye Jeep, and her love interest is this guy named Penn, who's her brother's best friend that she never got along with. This was one of the most nostalgic books that I've ever read. It has all of the like late 90s and early 2000s vibes, especially because this alternate reality that she gets dropped into, like her MASH game, everything about it is like everything that she was obsessed with when she was like a kid. So it's just so much fun, and like the romance between her and Penn is genuinely like one of my favorite things that I've ever read. Like I adored them. They were so cute. They would just have so many sweet conversations where I was like highlighting every single word. I was literally sending pictures of their conversations to my friend Brittany and like squealing. So this was an easy 5 out of 5 for me, not only because the romance is god tier, like literally so god tier, so good, but also because of the nostalgia. It was just everything. So I highly recommend reading this one when it comes out this summer. And then the last book, which I think this one is like my top favorite romance that I've read so far this year, is Starshipped by Cat Sebastian. You know, I've been hearing great things about this author throughout the years, and I don't know why I haven't picked up a book by this author yet, because after this experience, I'm like, oh, yes, I definitely understand the hype. And this book was absolutely everything. So in this story, we are following these 2 actors named Simon and Charlie, and both of them are actors on this sci-fi show that's called Out There. And this sci-fi show has been on the air for so many years now. I think it said that they've been on air for 7 years, and these actors have always been known to like not get along very well, even though a lot of their fans ship their characters together on the show. And it's so fun because as you're reading from Simon's perspective, he's constantly wondering like, is Charlie actually trying to play this romantically? And so the story begins when Simon is seriously considering leaving the show because he's starting to feel like he wants to do something a little bit more serious with his career, but because he doesn't want there to be like a huge falling out and like a big blow up when he leaves the show, they decide that they want to start acting more friendly in public together so that there's not this perception that they don't like each other. And so this story is about how they're like starting to get to know each other better off set. There's even a little bit of a road trip involved that they go on together. The chemistry, oh my god, it's just so good. I love both of these characters so much too, especially Simon, because Simon is dealing with a lot of different mental health struggles in this book. Like, he talks quite a bit about his anxiety, he has mild OCD, and then he also gets these migraines that are really bad. Oh my god, there were so many moments in this book that had me like crying with laughter and just like squealing over them. Like, the first kiss scene in this book was one of the most wholesome things that I've ever read in my life. I just can't get over how well written this book is, and like the chemistry between them was so freaking sweet. It was so sincere. And I kind of love how like their queerness doesn't scare them necessarily, because you know, I feel like it's so common when you read these books that are about like actors or like people that are in the eye of the public. They're constantly worried about like the perception of their fans or like the perception people will have of them if they find out that they're gay. But this book was so refreshing in the sense that like they never really cared. I just love them both so much. Like, I will be thinking about this book forever. I'm already like counting down the days, like when can I reread this, because I just loved it so much. The amount of annotating that I did in this book is actually ridiculous, and like I ran out of my pink tabs 2 separate times. So this book was very special to me, and I cannot wait to read more books from this author. Like, I am prioritizing those books so much right now. All right, so those are all of the books that I read in the month of March. I mean, as I mentioned, it was a really great reading month for the most part. I would love to know your thoughts if you've read any of these books. Let me know what you think of them. Let me know how many books did you read in the month of March, and did you find any new favorites? Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!